Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ghost Show. And I am one of our hosts, Sika Groves. I am an archaeologist, but I'm also a paranormal investigator and a medium. And Ian is with us today. Ian, you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Ian. I am a paranormal researcher and a paranormal investigator.
There we go. And normally we would have Rachel Bender with us today, who is a medium as well as a paranormal investigator, but she's unfortunately not available. She has a furnace emergency. It's getting cold, and apparently her furnace is not working today. So they're working on that. So today's topic, we thought we'd take a little dive into ghost stories around the holiday of Christmas. Because in the Victorian era, ghost stories were more popular at this time of year than they were at Halloween. Today, we generally associate ghost stories with Halloween, do we not?
We do indeed.
We do. But during the Victorian era, ghost stories were very popular at this time of year. And I don't know, Enid, did you have a chance to do any research on why they were popular? Or
No, I was just about to ask you that question as why were they so popular around Christmas time back then?
Well, I think really what it was is that we know that, of course, they didn't have television or film or any of those kinds of, sort of modern technologies. And at that time of year, like we know when we live in the Northern Hemisphere, it gets very cold and very dark. And, we're coming up to the solstice, the winter solstice, which will be the shortest day of the year and the longest night of the year. So at this time period, you would have been in the dark quite a bit to begin with, right? Because as we know, the sun is going down already just after 4 p.m. And at that time, and we're talking, earlier on in the era, even the late Georgian period and into the early Victorian period, before electricity or gas lighting was something to be had in homes, people were using candles to light their spaces. And so at this time of year, you would have been going through more candles because it was darker earlier. And so there's something to be said about darkness and the things that we associate with darkness. And I think that, as we know, even in our modern sort of world that we are now, we tend to like to believe that ghosts lurk about more in the dark than the daylight. And I think as researchers and investigators, we know that it doesn't really matter what time of the day it is.
That's right.
Right? It happens all the time. It doesn't have to be dark. But I think when we enter into darkness, that our senses seem to become more perceptive as well, right? So your eyesight might not be as good in the dark, but then your hearing, maybe
Your other senses pick up that drop off.
they do.
And intensify.
Yeah, they seem to intensify. So I think much like that, this time of year in the Victorian period or late Georgian period, that, these kinds of things would intensify. You spent more time indoors. It was dark. It was gloomy. And your forms of entertainment were quite limited to, playing games or listening to music, and at that time, it would have had to be somebody who could play the music because there was no radios, and telling stories. And this is where I think we see the introduction of the ghost story associated with this time of year because of the darkness, the shorter days, the longer nights, the idea of the solstice as well, but also that this is a time of year where we know the veil has somewhat thinned during Halloween or Samhain. And
right.
So we have this whole perception of the spirits being closer to us here on the earthly plane. And so these stories really do pique people's interests. And we have to look at it as a form of entertainment because that's really what it was. And there's nothing more fun than sitting around a roaring fire, listening to someone tell a good ghostly story. And we're all very familiar with A Christmas Carol, or Scrooge, as most people call it, but
Yes.
it's actually called A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. And I have behind me, this is an original illustration from the book,
Oh, very cool.
which Charles Dickens wrote and released. And in, I think it was 1842, actually, when the book came out. So at a period of time where, again, we don't have electric lighting, we don't have radios, we don't have television, but we have great stories to tell. And while everybody thinks this is kind of a Christmas tale, because it is around this time of year, Charles
It's
Dickens,
actually a ghost story.
it's a ghost story, right?
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And it's also a story of morality too, right? It's sort of a moral tale. We look at a number of different things throughout the story with Ebenezer Scrooge and his life, and what made him sort of the penny pinching miser that he is in the story. And when he was a young man. So we get this whole real encapsulation of how Scrooge ends up being who he is. And then we have this moral dilemma of, what happens to him when he's visited by the three spirits. And, it kind of takes us on that journey of perhaps making Scrooge realize that he's not been the nicest, kindest man over quite a few years, and that this intervention, if you will, by these spirits makes him rethink his sort of moral direction in his life, as to he could be kinder and more forgiving and more thoughtful of people, and less obsessed by money and goals of making money. And so it's a very interesting story. And Charles Dickens was a real people person in terms of writing about people's characters. I mean, all of his books are very character driven, with a sense of morality, because at that time period, let's face it, the church and religion had a great influence on everyday people. And so these stories kind of wander down that road of, people veering off in directions that maybe, like I say, even with Scrooge, were not considered to be very nice. They weren't very neighborly. They weren't very nice. So the idea here with the ghost stories is that there's an element of fear, right? There's an element of surprise. There's an element of the unknown. And I think that this story, A Christmas Carol, really talks about all of those things sort of in various capacities throughout the story. So
it does. Yeah.
Story. Yeah, it's a very compelling story. Also, we have other ghost stories. I mean, Charles Dickens had a whole anthology of ghost stories geared towards this time of year, this Christmas or this holiday Yuletide. It wasn't just the one story. And I mean, we mostly know this story because
right. That's the most popular one that everyone thinks of and gravitates to.
Right. And it's because it became popular because Hollywood popularized it for us. In our
yes, exactly. You've got that classic movie made in the 50s with Alastair Sim that everybody regards as the most classic of any version that's ever been produced.
Yeah.
And it is. It's wonderful. It's fabulous.
It is. I mean, and he's still my favorite actor who played the character of Ebenezer Scrooge. I think hands down, he just encapsulated everything about
the character. He did. He was phenomenal in that role.
But like I said, Dickens had other stories as well. And there's a whole anthology of his ghost stories around this time of year. But we have other writers who wrote, and there were penny dreadfuls written as well that came out around this time of year that touched on either ghosts or creatures of the night, and so again, it's the darkness and that, and And again, too, that the Victorian culture, people were very close to death, right? And when I say that, it was part of their everyday life. We're fairly removed from it now. Like, we don't generally keep our sick in our home with us. They end up going to a hospital or going to, places like this. But in that time, all of this would have taken place in the home for the most part. So you would have been quite close to it. Children would have seen their grandparents, being ill and perhaps being bedridden. And, it was just a part of life, right? And children as well. I mean, it was all walks of life were affected by death in the Victorian era because they didn't have the modern medicine and all of the tools that we have today. But it seems odd to us because we're quite removed from it for the most part. So, we don't see a lot of these stories like we had back then. But another really great one is a story called The Ghost and the Bone Setter. And
I know the name. I don't believe I've ever read it, but the name is familiar. Yes.
It's a short story written by Joseph L. Fanu, who was an Irish writer. And it's a fantastic story. And while it doesn't necessarily talk about, Christmas or the holiday like Scrooge does, like in A Christmas Carol, this one was very well known to be read, sort of in front of the fire at this time of year. But really great stories. That one too is a really fun story around a ghost and a graveyard and a rectory house, and just a kind of a story of a father and a son, and what happens in the graveyard when someone dies. And it's based on the Irish belief of, if you are the last person over the wall and in the graveyard to be buried, that you are responsible for bringing water to all the other spirits that are in purgatory until somebody comes to replace you. And so it's a really interesting story, but again, very popular around this time of year. And this was something that there's just, like I said, there's so many great ghost stories out there that people aren't aware of in terms of the Victorian era and the association of this time of year. Is there anything that you might want to add or ask, or are you?
Well, it's interesting to note that in today's culture and society, that over in Finland, there is a Christmas Eve tradition of the exchanging of books.
Yes.
On Christmas Eve, and then you spend your Christmas Eve reading the book, eating chocolates, drinking wine, or whatever. And in keeping with the whole Victorian tradition that we're talking about, who's to say that some of those books aren't some of these Victorian tales that